Want to give a quick shout out to all of my patrons. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. And I am done. Okay, so I just finished up reading The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is the first book in the Empire of the Wolf series, and I want to give you my unedited thoughts upon finishing this book, which was just right now. It's happened again. I just read another book that I would easily classify as a top 20 fantasy book that I've ever read in my life out of the hundreds and hundreds that I've read. I am blown away by how wonderful this book was from the beginning to the very end. I've never read a book quite like this before. And there's so many reasons that I love this book. I mean, normally when I do these kind of reviews, I kind of go over some of the pros and cons. But I quite literally can't think of a single con other than this book ended. But there is another one already out that I can just jump right into when I get around to it. So that's not even a con. This book is incredible. I've never heard of this author before, Richard Swan. I mean, I have heard of this book. It got a lot of play, I feel like, last year. A lot of booktube channels were reviewing it, and I just couldn't get around to it. My TBR was too big. And finally, I had a Patreon pick where I put in on my Patreon account, like 5 books, and this was one of them, and this book got the highest votes, so I committed myself to reading it. But I had kind of mixed feelings about it. I've heard a lot of mixed things. I certainly haven't heard some overwhelming consensus that this book is awesome. But this is one of those times, and I've said this before, but you ever read a book where you feel like it was like tailor-made to your tastes? That's what this one was. And, further worrying me about this book was that when I announced on my TBR video earlier this month, I had people coming in saying, they don't predict that I'm going to like this book because of what my tastes are, that this is kind of a mystery book. And I'm not a big mystery fan. I was a long time ago before I really read fantasy, but that's just not what I like. And this was definitively a mystery book. But man, it's good. The writing is so wonderful. It's just, again, just like the perfect book. And before I kind of nitpick and go into the parts specifically that I loved about it, I have to mention this thing that I was talking about with people in my Discord. And if you ever join the Discord to chat about these books or any book-related thing, hit the link down below. I'd love to chat with you. But I mentioned the tension in this book because this book was extremely tense in a good way. I have oftentimes, and I think fantasy is very popular for having tense moments. It's kind of a hallmark of fantasy. But in so many fantasy books, even ones that I love, the tense moments, you get these characters that are stuck in this thing and, they have to get out. But you kind of know that they're going to be fine. They're the protagonist. It's going to be okay. But you don't feel that tension, even though they're in this really horrible moment. In this book, I quite literally was sweating bullets for a lot of this book, not just like a chapter or two. A lot of this book had these moments that I had my jaw just straight up dropped. I couldn't stop reading. I was sweating. And I haven't really had this feeling, and I'm trying to think if I've ever had this feeling since I read A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin over 10 years ago. I haven't had that feeling. And it's such a refreshing thing to have this author be able to evoke that emotion from me. It's just a wonderful, wonderful feeling. And it's all credit to just the way that this author writes. I mean, you have this book that is written in a framing narrative. The protagonist, or I don't even know if this protagonist, but the writer of this story is kind of tagging along with the protagonist of this story. And writing as this main person is an old woman recounting her life's tale. So you know that she's fine. Clearly she's fine because when she's talking about this tale, she was younger, like early 20s, I feel like. So nothing bad happens, but I couldn't stop feeling like the world was going to end because of the events that were happening to this young woman. It's amazing. So just with that said, let me go break down different aspects of this book and what I loved about it. So first, what is this book roughly about? In general, this is a book about a lawyer. And a king's justice who represents the king or maybe an emperor, and they go around on a traveling circuit and judge cases. So you've got this huge empire, and these problems will happen, but they don't have lawyers to be able, or these justices to come and determine, if this person needs to be in jail, if they need to be beheaded, like what needs to happen. And so they hold off on judging these cases until one of these judges can come into town. And this is kind of like, maybe other countries did it, but I'm from America. I know American history quite well. And this is kind of like early American history and what they used to do. I mean, little known fact, Abraham Lincoln's, one of his jobs was a traveling lawyer that did, now he clearly wasn't like a justice and being able to behead people or make determinations, but he argued cases in a circuit in a very similar way. And I've always been fascinated by that. Abraham Lincoln is an enormous hero of mine, my favorite president, and I don't say that with a little bit of weight. I work in politics. I've read extensively on American history and presidents, and I really look up to Abraham Lincoln and his life story. So I've always been enamored by this idea of this traveling circuit for courts. And to have a fantasy book, my favorite thing, implementing this thing that I've never been able to read about in a fantasy genre before, was wonderful. But that's not the parts of this book that I felt really grabbed me. They got me hooked in from the beginning. But the writing style is extremely well done. Now, the author does a little bit of trying to upscale the words. You get the feeling like he used a thesaurus sometimes and said, what's the more complicated word I can use here? Because there were a lot of times reading this book that luckily I'm on a Kindle here, that I could just highlight the word and figure out what it meant, because more so than almost any other book that I've ever read. It's not like complicated writing, but there's just these words thrown in where I'm like, huh? What is that? I've heard it before, but I couldn't define it for you. So yeah, a lot of that. But the writing is very well done. The prose is, good to great scale. But just the way that he structures his story, the way that he gets you sucked in before really bringing the hammer down. Just the whole structure of this thing is wonderfully done. The plot here, it starts off very slow. What you feel like you're going to read is these like little individual stories about him going to different towns and in judging these cases, and like a set of mysteries. But that's not what we get here. Very quickly on, we realize that the whole book is going to be centered around this one case, but the case has enormous implications, and you learn that from that future tense of this writer who's telling you as you're going, like, I don't want to ruin anything, so I won't, but saying things like, and this turned out to be a way bigger deal down the line to the kingdom. So that there's this like, oh wow, what's going to happen here, and how is this going to have a bigger part? But once all the pieces are set in place and you really get all the characters involved, that character writing comes in. These characters are so well done. Specifically, the main three characters of this book. You have the main justice. You have the POV of this young woman who is his like clerk, and then you have like his right-hand man who kind of is just like the catch-all, do-it-all kind of person. And those three play off each other very well. But then you have all these bit part characters that are also extremely well done. But mainly this main one protagonist is just wonderfully written. But as you get these characters in, and the plot really starts to take them hold, you just get so enraptured with the story. The magical elements here, I think, were extremely well done. As I got about a halfway through point of this book, I was thinking to myself, this book didn't need the fantasy elements in it to be what it was. They could have been entirely stripped out of this book because they didn't play a major part. Kind of like the Greenbone Saga. I remain adamant that if the Greenbone Saga didn't have any fantasy elements in it at all, it would not have changed the story, and the story would be just as good as it ended up being. But later on in the book, you start getting more. Essentially, what happens in this book is the judges here have these magical powers that are granted to them from the emperor. And they can do a series of things that make them really good lawyers. Like they can compel somebody to tell the truth. They can bring somebody back from the dead to interview them. Now these powers feel overpowered, but if somebody is extremely like strong-willed, or I don't want to ruin the other aspect of this, but there's another type of person that's kind of more immune to these powers. So really it applies to the average person they're interviewing, not like the main suspect. But yeah, it's very well done. And as it gets along, there's some twists involved in the powers and who can use them and why they can use them. And yeah, the fantasy elements, they're not overdone. They're very specific, but it works to perfection. And it actually elevates the book significantly because of them. The world building here, the world is fantastic. I mean, you get that nice mix of these geopolitical things going on that are going to play a bigger part in future books. But then you get a very isolated story here as well. The story really only takes place in 2 little towns. But you hear about so many other things going on and the promise that you're going to be going other places. It's got this huge map that I love. I love maps that are larger than the story, and this map is way bigger. I mean, you get to see, other kingdoms and other things that are playing a bigger part here, but the world just feels so alive. It's always hard to describe world building, in my opinion. Maybe I'm just not a great reviewer, but for me, a great world is when you can just keep thinking about it when the book's over, and you can have such a clear picture in your mind. I mean, I'm one of those readers that doesn't picture things. I see characters and I can't really picture them perfectly. I'm more of like a plot reader. But in this book, I had this clear image of what everybody looked like, what the towns looked like, every scene. It was just so vivid and well done. I mentioned I think I've mentioned all of the aspects of this book that I would need to. I'm trying to think of like all the different parts of a book that I review. I think I touched on them all, except for the biggest one, and that is how much fun did I have. I had more fun reading this book than, it's right up there with my top favorite fun moments in books. It's not fun in the Kings of the Wild sense, where it's just like, like you're enjoying your time. This is tense, but it's fun. It's so fun for the intensity value. This book starts to get dark, and if you know my reviews, I love a darker book. And this book very much takes a turn for the dark and then kind of sticks in that direction as we go along. I love it when books kind of turn that up on you. It doesn't rely on any gimmicks or tricks or weird twists. It all makes sense. It all fits together. And I just am so excited that I have another series that I get to just obsess over, that I get to rant and rave about how wonderful this book is. And then I just, once again, in the year 2023, that I read a book that I will forever think is one of the greatest fantasy books that I've ever read. Just cannot wait to start the second book. I will massively move it up on my reading list, probably read it in the next month or 2, which I know a lot of people are like, you should read your books back to back. It's just not how I do things on my channel. I'm reading 10 plus series at a time. I space things out. But whereas normally I would wait a few months to read the next one, this one I'll probably be like half that. So super excited. If you have been holding off on this book, if you like a darker book, if you like a mystery, even if you don't like those things, I think you'll still get a lot of enjoyment out of this. I know I did. So I'm going to end it off there. Thank you so much for bearing with me for this rather long review. And as always, happy reading to you. Thank you so much to my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier patrons, Anna, Ben, Brian, CJ, Donut, Darren, Jamie, Maria, Michael Sugarman, My Book is Lit, Nev's Book Channel, Romeo Mike, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L., and Sky.